opioids along with local anesthetics are there to stay and are really useful. We come to the second adjuvant. Everybody of us is aware of it. Everybody of us use it. And in India, I just want to put across, we get two solutions, one in 80,000 and one in 200,000. So you should be very clear what are you using, because the amount of adrenaline which goes up in one in 80,000 is tremendous. There have been recent guidelines from the dentistry councils of US where they have accepted that patients who are hypertensive or patients who are controlled CAD patients, you could use diluted lidocaine with adrenaline. So what we were trying to say no to our dental colleagues, now we have accepted them, and we dilute 1 in 200,000 solutions and we use them. We allow them to be used. However, a word of caution to the younger people, intravascular injection is always an issue, so one must be careful. Now, I think whole of India, every medical school, every department in anesthesia, everybody who's into practice and practices local anesthesia would have come across use of clonidine as an adjuvant for regional anesthesia. Well, we all know the pharmacology. It's an alpha-2 agonist, and that's what it does, and that's what is the way it works. Earlier, it was available orally. Then when the parenteral preparation came, it was used to take care of hypertension, and now it's for all possible routes, intrathecal, epidural, and peripheral nerve blocks. It works. It extends the blocks. It gives you a good effect. Your blocks last longer. Analgesia is there. However, it has its own side effects of hypertension, bradycardia, and other things. Again, a recent article, and this is from UCMS GTB Hospital. I think the authors are here, somewhere sitting here. I've put it here. That's why they have used intrathecal clonidine along with bupivacaine in older patients. And that's why I put this paper here. They are elderly group of patients, and they had excellent results with 15 micrograms of clonidine along with bupivacaine. This is the next drug. Everybody in India uses it or plans to use it, though it is not allowed as by Drug Controller of India also. We had a tough time trying to get ethics committee in our hospital agree to it, but they never agreed. We didn't even get a limited approval of its use, but there are many papers from India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and other parts of Eastern Europe maybe, where it has been used as an adjuvant for regional anesthesias. Well, this is an article, and this is one of the oldest I have in mind, which is 2013 April, BJ, and it has, you must look at editor's key points, and I thought Ravi Mahajan was here, but it's not his key points in BJ, it was the section editor, and they still find that it is still not acceptable to be used as a routine agent for regional anesthesia along with bupivacaine. So a word of caution as far as dexmedetomidine is concerned. Again, another one, 2014, people have now started using it in pediatrics. So once something is allowed to be used in pediatrics, one feels very safe. So this is an article which is again head of print. You'll see it next month. They have used in pediatric caudal patients. It's a meta-analysis, and the results are good. You may use it if ethically you feel correct. You may have research on it, but till date, the Drug Controller of India doesn't allow it to be used for this in this route. You could use it as an off-label drug. Sodium bicarbonate. Well, I have put this slide here because I use it if I use lidocaine, and I want my block to be enhanced. It's an old thing. It's a very old thing, but maybe older people use it when you have to improve the onset, especially in an epidural if you're using only epidural lidocaine. I'll just take a minute some more. I have written methylprednisolone there in this slide along with dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is here because I think this is going to come in a big way and it's going to stay. Methylprednisolone is here. I have mentioned it here because I would want everybody here to be aware of the fact that methylprednisolone preparations or epidural preparations which are used for low backache in India carry a drug insert that should not be used in the epidural space. So if you land up into a soup, you will have a very time protecting yourself. It is very clearly written on the drug insert, both of methylprednisolone and triamcinolone. Again, an article, 2011 June, and they feel that dexamethasone really enhances the blocks. This is the last one, and I end with this, just with this diagram, this bar diagram. You must note it. We have used adjuvants. This is a slightly older article in 2011, and they compared the cell death percentage after 2-hour duration of exposure in rat nerves. And the 4 adjuvants which were used were clonidine, midazolam, dextromethorphan, and look what happens. If only ropivacaine was used, which is a dark bar, which is there, the first one, look at the death percentage of cell deaths in the nerve. So things are not all that fine. We need some more research to carry out and use these opioids. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Anjan Trika, for such an excellent lecture, excellent compilation of the data, especially from 2013-14. Thanks very much, really, for enlightening us, and we are going to have discussion at the end of the session. It brings us to the point that I'm here to invite the next speaker for enlightening us on the topic, and that's mainly related to, kind of personalized, that's what I was talking about, a personalized post-operative analgesia. And the speaker here is Dr. Senthil from US. Dr. Senthil, you were initially in All India Institute, and then in the end, you were here with us at University College of Medical Sciences for a few months. We had a very joint publication with him, and good to see you, yes.
Yeah.
So thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, kind invitation, and the opportunity to talk here. So this topic is a little bit different, and it's more futuristic, and it's related to regional anesthesia as well. And so I'll get started. So what is personalized analgesia? So it's providing optimal pain relief without any adverse effects for an individual patient with the right analgesic at the right dose. So to do that, we had to identify first the patients that were high risk for inadequate pain relief and also high risk for, say, local anesthetic-related toxicity, including ventricular arrhythmias, hypotension, and poor cardiac outcomes, and also opioid-related respiratory depression and inadequate pain relief with opioids, so that we can rescue them with regional analgesia more. So how to identify patients at risk? So who are at-risk patients? So the at-risk patients are patients at risk for opioid-related respiratory depression. We see a lot of them in pediatric anesthesia. And those at risk for local anesthetic-induced ventricular arrhythmias and even deaths related to local anesthetics and local anesthetic toxicity. Some are at higher risk than others, and we had to identify those at high risk. So we have just scratched the surface of identifying those at risk. There are 2 steps to personalize analgesia and bring that to practice. So we are in the very early phase, and so I think in the next 10 years, we will have something tangible in clinical practice. We already developed a gene chip, and we are practicing a couple of personalized analgesia with opioids, so I'll share some of the findings. And the next step, once we identify those at high risk, we can do targeted intervention. So probably you're all aware of, say, deaths in children who are breastfed by moms who are taking codeine. So there are ultra-rapid metabolizers of codeine. Codeine is a prodrug. It doesn't act as such as an analgesic. It has to be converted into morphine. So there are multiple reports of deaths in infants. And even after surgery, like tonsillectomy, there are multiple reports of deaths with the use of codeine. So we had to identify those ultra-rapid metabolizers and give a drug which will not depend on CYP2D6 metabolism. And then target with right opioid, like morphine. Instead of giving codeine, we can give morphine directly, or oxycodone and hydromorphone. These are all targeted interventions to bypass that one metabolic problem. Then the targeted intervention, it's similar to local anesthetic, where we give the drug where it is needed. Unlike opioids, we give to the whole system, and it is not specific. So what we are talking about is precision medicine, so it will take at least 10 years, as I talked about. So I'll start with opioids and end with local anesthetic. So opioids, because we use all the time whenever a child or an adult comes for surgery. So we see a lot more side effects and inadequate pain relief with opioids. That's because opioids have very narrow therapeutic indices, and also we see huge interpatient variability. In the US, at least, we see a very diverse population. We see patients from European origin background, African background, Asian background. So we have almost very diverse population. And I did anesthesia here in India, so we used to give a lot less morphine and other opioids here. And I give almost 2-3 times more medication for same age patient in the US. And the white patients require less, and the black patients need a lot more opioids for the same surgery. And it's determined by underlying genetic differences. And so whenever we have a child or an adult with a problem like nausea, vomiting, or respiratory depression, or even inadequate pain control, they stay in the recovery room longer. That contributes to economic burden to the society. So it's not only futuristic, it's very complex. And you can see the slide is so complex. So many factors, genetic factors and non-genetic factors, contribute to inter-individual variations. So I'll talk about the non-genetic variation because we are all familiar with that. So age, for example, extreme premature baby, and very geriatric patients. We see a lot of 80, 90-year-olds coming for anesthesia. They don't take a lot. So those are extremely vulnerable to opioid adverse effects. And also patients with sleep apnea. Fortunately, we don't see a lot of sleep apnea in India. So childhood obesity is very common. Even adult obesity is very, very common. Almost 2/3 of American population are obese. They have a lot more sleep apnea. They are sensitive to opioids, and they have respiratory depression very easily postoperatively. And the genetic component, there are 2 components. The pharmacokinetics, how a drug is metabolized, and it can lead to variations. We briefly talked about codeine. So codeine has to be converted into morphine. And there are 4 different types of people. So one is poor metabolizer. If you give codeine, they do not convert into morphine. So they will not get any pain relief if you give even 10 times higher dose of codeine. And the other extreme with the codeine is ultra-rapid metabolizer. And for a given normal dose of codeine, they will form 10 times higher concentration of morphine. So that's why many breastfed infants and patients after tonsillectomy died because they are ultra-rapid metabolizers. They had sleep apnea on top of it. So they were very sensitive, and they had poor outcomes. So that's pharmacokinetic variations. So we know morphine is metabolized by uridine glucuronide transferase. So we see some genetic variation of uridine glucuronide transferase contributing to it. Morphine 6-glucuronide, it's a lot stronger than morphine. And we see that morphine 6-glucuronide-related respiratory depression a lot more after a couple of doses of morphine. And all opioids go to brain, where the main site of action is, to relieve pain, and also the respiratory depression, nausea, vomiting, and sedation from opioids are all central mu effects. So how morphine is transported to the brain and transported out of brain is determined by a couple of transporters. There's one particular transporter called, there's a P-glycoprotein transporter, or ABCB1. The normal function of that transporter is to efflux out morphine from brain. So if people have defective function of the transporter, we see very frequently in the patients of European origin, 30% have defective ABCB1 transporter. They have a lot more morphine and other opioids in the system, and they contribute to good pain relief in some patients, and also excessive side effects, especially in children, including respiratory depression and PONV. The other component is pharmacodynamics. So we all know about mu opioid receptor, which is the main target for all opioids. And a genetic variation of that can result in difference in opioid doses, up to 4 times higher doses in certain patients. And also some patients will have inadequate pain control with a given dose. So take an example. So in a typical surgical patient coming for surgery, this can be a hand surgery or any other surgery, and the pain impulse goes through the spinal cord to the brain. And for a given incision or any noxious stimulus, patients perceive pain differently. That's determined by one particular enzyme, which is called COMT, catechol-O-methyltransferase. How much catechol-O-methyltransferase we have in the brain determines how we perceive pain, how we respond to anxiety, how we cope with pain. So people are different genetically. That's why they have different levels of catechol-O-methyltransferase. We briefly talked about ABCB1, which is the transporter at the blood-brain barrier level, and the mu opioid receptor, which is the main target for opioids. So I'm going to briefly talk about genetics. It's, I know we all did genetics a long time ago during medical school. I'll be talking in very simple terms. What is a genetic variation? So I'll be brief since it is a complex topic. So this is just a mu opioid gene. So it has exons and introns. So we can see one particular genetic variation is 118G. It's very common in Indian population and Asian population, Chinese as well. And you can see this is well studied. What it does is patients can be of three types for this particular genetic variation. So at position 118, a patient can be AA or AG or GG. If a patient is GG, that patient will need 4 times a higher dose of morphine for the same surgery compared to an AA patient. And the AA patients are at higher risk for respiratory depression and other side effects. So the genetic change in the gene will result in change in the proteins, which is the mu receptor. So it will change the function of the protein, the receptor, depending on the underlying genetic variation. And this is the ABCB1 transporter, which is the blood-brain barrier transporter we briefly talked about. And its main function is it considers all opioids as toxins in the body, and it will try to efflux out of the brain. And we see this one responsible for multiple cases of respiratory depression and death in our population. I'll briefly say the patients of one particular ABCB1 genetic variation, GG patients, are almost 4.7-fold at increased risk for respiratory depression, and they stay longer in the recovery room compared to the GA patients. Compared to AA patients, they will have more than 10-fold increase in the risk of respiratory depression. I'll skip a couple of slides because they are even complex to explain, and also we don't have a lot of time. One thing which is important is economically, we track everything economically in the US. So we can see that depending on the genotype, how long a patient stays in the recovery room. This is fatty acid amide hydrolase. It's another system, it's the endocannabinoid pathway. A patient of AA genotype stayed almost 30 minutes longer in the recovery room after a simple tonsillectomy than the GG patients, and they were charged about $160 more. The cost of doing the genotyping of this particular gene is less than $1. It's actually 10 cents, which is equivalent to 6 rupees, I think. It's very cheap, and all we are trying to do is identify which are important genes and trying to develop a gene chip. So we briefly talked about mu receptor, and patients of AA genotype, they have a 37% higher risk for respiratory depression. The GG genotype, which is very resistant to opioid effects and also side effects, they have less than 1% risk of respiratory depression. So to summarize, these are the genes and the outcome differences perioperatively. The COMT is associated with pain scores and how we perceive pain. ABCB1, all other genes are associated with respiratory depression. So how we put all these things together. So we can identify and risk stratify all these patients into low risk, high risk based on underlying genes. So you can see that this is for respiratory depression. We looked at 50 other different genes. So these are the genes on the bottom part, the 50 different ones. Based on the genotype alone, we can see that 10% risk versus 38% risk of respiratory depression can be diagnosed. And to make it to an individual patient, we do the decision tree, and we can identify an individual patient whether they have high risk or low risk based on the genotype. So the future is we will be able to personalize analgesia. We have promising findings. We already have a gene chip, so for opioids, we are using it even clinically, at least for codeine, oxycodone, hydromorphone kind of drugs, or oral drugs when children go home after surgery with strong opioids. So briefly about local anesthetics. The local anesthetics also have narrow therapeutic indices, and some patients are very resistant to local anesthetics, including lidocaine, which is well studied. And some patients have ventricular arrhythmias, lung QT syndrome, and significant hypotension after, say, thoracic epidurals, and even decreased poor morbidity and mortality after surgery with the spinal anesthesia because of hypotension and arrhythmia-related risk. And those can be predicted by underlying genetics. So I will briefly touch upon a couple of genes in interest of time. So ventricular arrhythmia and lung QT syndrome and deaths have been associated with a couple of genetic variations in the cardiac sodium channel receptor genes. So these are listed. And the hypotension and postoperative outcomes are associated with adrenergic beta 2 and adrenergic beta 1 receptor genetic variations. I will stop right here and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Senthil.
Thank you. Shubir.
Now the last topic of this session, that is anticoagulants and antiplatelet agents, implication for regional SC. This is a very, very important topic as we see number of patients now with stents and this thing on anticoagulants and coming for surgery. To take this topic, I would like to invite Dr. Anjali Chhabra from All India Institute.
Good afternoon. Like Dr. Gogia was saying, this is a vital part of any regional anesthesia conference, and talking about anticoagulants and antiplatelet drugs. So we have a formidable arsenal. There are so many antiplatelet drugs, so many anticoagulants. But the question is, why do we need to know about them? It's all because of spinal hematoma. The incidence is not exactly known, it's only estimated. Most of us remember the paper by Triba et al., which says that a hematoma can occur after 1 in 200,000 epidurals and 1 in 1,50,000, sorry, the other way around, 1 in 200,000 spinals and 1 in 150,000 epidurals. But this was in the pre-anticoagulant era. Once low molecular weight heparin was introduced in America and it was being used in BD doses without any clear guidelines, the incidence of hematomas really increased to 1 in 40,000 after a spinal and as high as 1 in 6,000 after epidurals. The incidence was even higher when epidural catheters was used, and the incidence went up to 1 in 3,000. Now in Europe, they were using low molecular weight heparin very conservatively in single day dosing, and they found that the incidence was high. Moen and al. Did a retrospective review over 10 years, and they found that the incidence was 1 in 18,000. But what was of note was that when they studied the young obstetric population, the incidence was the same as what had been reported by Triba et al., that is 1 in 200,000. But in older patients, ladies who were undergoing knee arthroplasty, they had a higher incidence of 1 in 3,600. This was because they had more difficult backs, they had more anticoagulants, and these patients had more renal dysfunction. So right now the latest information that we have on this data is according to the third National Audit Project report by the Royal College of Anaesthetists, which has found that there were 5 out of 700,000 neuroaxial block patients developed spinal hematomas. So the calculated incidence is now 1 in 88,000 to 1 in 1,40,000, which stands at present. Now coming to each of these drugs, I'm going to go through them fast so that we can all go for lunch. Aspirin, we know aspirin or acetyl salicylic acid causes irreversible blockage of the platelet function. So the platelets do not recover for 7 to 10 days, and this effect is dose dependent and more so with doses of more than 100 milligrams per day. The other COX inhibitors, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they produce a reversible inhibition of COX-1 inhibitors. So as a result, their function of the platelets normalizes after 12 to 24 hours of stopping the drug. The COX-2 enzymes we know are not there in the platelets, so they do not affect platelet function at all. The recommendations are that if a patient is taking aspirin alone, there is no significant additional risk for spinal hematoma. However, if the patient is concomitantly taking oral anticoagulants unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin, the risk increases tremendously. So in the post-operative period, such patients should be switched over to unfractionated heparin for thromboprophylaxis. If a patient is receiving low molecular weight heparin pre-operatively along with the aspirin, then we should wait for 24 hours before we do a block in this patient or we try to remove the catheter. Patients who have coronary stents in situ, whether they're bare metal stents or drug-eluting stents, in these patients for 6 weeks with bare metal stents and 6 months with drug-eluting stents, it is recommended that dual antiplatelet therapy should continue. And if this is continuing, then neuroaxial blocks are contraindicated. Now the thienopyridines are the new antiplatelet drugs which have been introduced, and they irreversibly inhibit the P2Y12 platelets, and they inhibit ADP from binding to it and then inhibit platelet aggregation. The oldest one introduced was ticlopidine, but it has found to have some bone marrow suppression, so it's not any longer being used. But even if a patient is on ticlopidine, it should be stopped for 10 to 14 days before we do a block. Clopidogrel is the commonest one being used, and it has to be stopped for 7 days before we do a block. In a patient who has a high risk of recurrent angina, we can stop it for 5 days and do the block. Prasugrel is the newest one that has been added. Again, though it has a rapid onset of action, because it has an irreversible action, we have to wait for 7 to 10 days before the new crop of platelets come, and a block should only be done after 7 to 10 days of stopping this drug. Now coming to the glycoprotein 2B3A inhibitors, this is the receptor site where the fibrinogen binds to the platelets, and that's how a platelet clot is formed or a plug is formed. And these GB2B3A inhibitors have a reversible action, and the action usually gets reversed by 48 hours with abciximab, in 24 hours with eptifibatide, and 8 hours with tirofiban. And that's why it is safer to use them, and they are used as bridge therapy for patients who have coronary stents in situ when they are scheduled for surgery. Recommendations are that one should wait for the recommended time before giving a block. So 8 to 10 hours for tirofiban and eptifibatide, and 48 hours for abciximab. And since there is some incidence of thrombocytopenia, a platelet count should be done. Now coming to our old friend unfractionated heparin, we know it's a very large molecule, and it has an active pentasaccharide sequence which binds to factor 2A or thrombin. It is administered by the IV route where the onset of action is immediate, and when it is given by subcutaneous route, the peak effect or the onset occurs after 1 to 2 hours. IM dose is not given because it can cause a hematoma. In contrast, low molecular weight heparin is a smaller molecule. It has been cleaved enzymatically, and it has a better clearance by the kidneys. So this figure shows how antithrombin 3 normally has a very low affinity for binding with prothrombin, with factor 2A or thrombin. But when the pentasaccharide sequence of heparin binds to antithrombin 3, the affinity for it to bind with factor 2A increases by 100 to 1000 times, and as a result it results in inhibition of factor 2A, and this is especially seen with the larger molecules of heparin which are of 18 polysaccharide chain or higher. The smaller molecules, such as even lower molecular weight heparin is a smaller molecule, they cause more inhibition of factor 10A. And heparin, as we can see, loves to bind to any proteins or endothelium as well as the mast cells in the body. That's why it has a lower bioavailability. Low molecular weight heparin has a 90% bioavailability. It has therefore a more consistent action. It has a longer duration of action of 12 hours as compared to only 4 to 6 hours with heparin. And with heparin, because of its inconsistent effect, we have to monitor the activated partial thromboplastin time, but we don't need to do any monitoring of factor 10A for low molecular weight heparin. So as far as using the thromboprophylactic dose of unfractionated heparin is concerned, that is 2 daily doses of subcutaneous heparin, neuroaxial block can safely be performed. However, there is recent literature to say that 2 daily doses are not enough, and 3 daily doses are more effective for preventing thromboprophylaxis. However, for these doses, as such, there is no safety recommendations for doing a central neuroaxial block. If a patient has been on heparin for more than 4 days, then because of the fear of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, platelet count should be done before the block, and one should wait for 4 hours after the last dose of heparin, after stopping it, and it should be restarted before doing the block or removing a catheter, and it should be restarted 1 hour after the intervention. We have to ensure that there are no other concomitant antiplatelets or anticoagulants that the patient is receiving. As far as the dose that is given intraoperatively during vascular surgery, that is 5,000 to a maximum of 10,000 units is concerned, a block should not be planned in these patients if they have coagulopathies, and one should delay administration of heparin for at least 1 hour after the block has been done. Post-operatively, if the heparin is continued, then the catheter should be removed 2 to 4 hours after stopping the drug, and it should be restarted only 1 hour after the catheter has been removed. What is important in the new ASTRA guidelines is they say that even after this, the patient should be monitored post-operatively closely for neurological loss, for motor loss, and in addition, you should use low concentration of local anesthetics so that early detection of a hematoma can be done. In case we've had difficulty in doing the block or we've had blood in the catheter on the needle, then we should not, and we intend to give heparin intraoperatively. There is no data to support mandatory cancellation of all cases. Instead, one should have a discussion with the surgeon and decide what is the risk-benefit ratio, and then decide to proceed with surgery. For cardiac surgery, where the patient goes on cardiopulmonary bypass, thoracic epidurals are not recommended at the present time because there isn't enough data and there is enough experience to support their use. But in case a patient has a catheter in situ, then one has to be very careful. One has to stop the heparin in the post-operative period, check the coagulation parameters before the catheter is removed. The same things apply to low molecular weight heparin as well. If the low doses are used, single day doses, then the needle, if one dose has been given, a low dose, 1 milligram per kg of enoxaparin, then the needle has to be placed 10 to 12 hours after the dose. But if thrombolytic doses are used, for example in acute coronary syndrome, then the dose has to be given 24 hours later. Neuroaxial anesthesia should be avoided if the low molecular weight heparin has been given just 2 hours earlier, because that corresponds to the peak effect of the drug. Post-operatively, if you are planning on a single day dosing, then we can give the drug 6 to 8 hours post-operatively and then repeat it every 24 hours. The catheter should be removed 12 hours after the last dose, and next dose should be given 2 hours after catheter removal. In case while doing the block, like I said earlier, it was a difficult block or we had blood in the catheter or needle, then the first dose of low molecular weight heparin should be given only 24 hours after end of surgery. Post-operatively, if we intend to give it low molecular weight heparin twice a day, then we should not leave the catheter in situ. The first dose should be given after 24 hours after the surgery, and the catheter should be removed before this, and the next dose should be at least 2 hours after catheter removal. Now coming to the oral anticoagulants, warfarin, we all know that it inhibits the the decarboxylation of the vitamin K dependent factors. It is very excellent because it can be taken orally, but it has a very narrow therapeutic range and requires monitoring of the prothrombin time and the INR ratio. If we intend to do a block in a patient who is on chronic warfarin therapy, then the drug should be stopped for 4 to 5 days prior, and one should ensure that the PT-INR values are less than 1.5. In the first 1 to 3 days after warfarin discontinuation, the INR values might come back to normal, but that is because the factor 7 has the shortest half-life and that recovers fastest, whereas factor 2 and 10 might take some time. So don't give in to temptation, wait for 4 to 5 days before doing the block. Low dose warfarin can be used with epidurals. We have to monitor the PT-INR every day, and the catheters have to be removed when the INR is less than 1.5. If it is more than 3, then we need to withhold warfarin, and we need to let it come back to normal. A drug that has been introduced, I think about 5 years back into the market, is Fondaparinux, and it's being commonly used. It is a synthetic pentosaccharide which selectively binds to factor 10A. It's got good bioavailability. In the prophylactic doses of 2.5 milligrams OD, neuroaxial anesthesia has been found to be safe. However, that the catheter has to be removed 36 hours after the last dose, and the next dose should be given only 12 hours later. In therapeutic doses of 5 to 10 milligrams, neuroaxial anesthesia is contraindicated. As far as thrombolytic therapy goes, we all know that a patient who has got a spinal or an epidural should not get streptokinase or urokinase for 10 days, for a 10-day period. In case, or a patient who is getting has got thrombolytic drug should be told not to volunteer for a spinal or epidural, tell the anesthetist. But in case a person who's got it needs to get the drug in the post-operative period and following an ischemic event, and by mistake the patient gets it, then we have to monitor the patient closely, and we have to measure the fibrinogen levels before we remove the epidural catheter. So there are a lot of new anticoagulants and there are a lot of formulas to calculate how long we should wait and when should the next dose be given, but none of these are standardized. As far as deep plexus blocks are concerned, the paravertebral and lumbar plexus, there have been reports of retroperitoneal hematomas in patients who've got lumbar plexus blocked and they were on anticoagulants. So the ASTRA recommendations are that we should follow the recommendations that are given for neuroaxial techniques. As far as ultrasound guided superficial blocks like the axillary, femoral and sciatic nerve block go, they can be performed with anticoagulants and antiplatelet therapy, but of course it depends on the skill of the person who's doing the blocks and the machines that are available. And of course this has not been standardized, this recommendation. These are my references. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali, for excellent compilation of your slides and enlightening us on the topic. Now, of course, the session is open for discussion. Of course, we started with Rajeshwari and then went on to personalized medicine. In between, Dr. Anjan Trikha's lecture was there, and this one, the last one. Any questions so far? I know it's lunchtime. Yeah, please. Please,
Sir,
be brief when you are actually asking the
is,
question, please.
To Dr. Anjan Trikha, sir. Regarding adjuvant, sir, have you any experience about the intrathecal use of calcitonin? Because in some, have you any experience of intrathecal calcitonin?
No, I don't. Do you have?
Actually,
No, yes, come on.
in some internet journal of anesthesia, I have seen that some PG students have used this thing and they claim that it prolonged the analgesic effect.
That's what I said. All these things are not acceptable ethically as far as the drug controller of India is concerned. We've not used it and we really won't advocate it. Yes, you could get away using these kind of drugs if you have a patient who is terminally ill or for palliative care, but not that. I would really not advise you to do it and I have no experience.
Oh, thank you, sir.
If you allow me, I have some questions
Yeah,
to
please,
Senthil,
Dr. Anjan.
Right, maybe it's getting late, but I just wanted to know a few things, Senthil. 7% of children would be metabolizers to codeine, right? 7%, 8%? Is it acceptable to put all children coming, because in US you would use a lot of codeine in the post-operative period for children, right? Anybody with any kind of surgery, lip, palate or uteroplasty will get oral codeine, right? So is it on, or do you have some kind of a bedside test that you check for rapid metabolizers? That is one. And the second is, if a lady has red hair or she has light eyes, they respond differently to opioids. So do you do some genetic test in these group of women?
So these are excellent questions. So the US FDA, which is the drug control body of the US, they recently did the strong black box warning on codeine. So if for children who undergo tonsillectomy, they say don't give codeine. So it depends on the ethnic background. So in European patients, the ultra-rapid metabolizers who are at risk for respiratory depression and death are only 2%. And on the other hand, African Americans, they have higher percentage, 5%. And Ethiopians have the highest incidence of ultra-rapid metabolizers. They have 30%. So we won't give anybody from Ethiopian origin codeine because they are at higher risk for opioid adverse effects. What we do is we have a clinical test. We do before surgery, the CYP2D6 testing, and we incorporate that result in our electronic medical record. Then when a surgeon or somebody, physician is trying to write any opioid, oral opioid for home use, it will trigger an alarm. So this patient is an ultra-rapid metabolizer, don't use codeine, tramadol, hydrocodone. These are all affected by this particular metabolism. You may use morphine, hydromorphone, or other drugs, other opioids. So we have that clinical decision algorithm incorporated in our electronic medical record for one particular gene, the CYP2D6.
But if a child comes, does he undergo a genetic test first? No. Or a family history or the race or whatever?
Yeah, so we don't do routinely for clinical purposes because we just don't give codeine, so as a routine drug. And, but for a research study, and we are doing routinely for that study, we are doing preoperatively. So women with red hair, they have maybe three anesthesia-related events. So they need higher doses of desflurane or inhalational anesthetics. The red hair is it's a phenotype, which is a clinical manifestation of a change in melanocortin-1 receptor gene. So those patients need a lot more desflurane inhalational agents. They are resistant to local anesthetics, so they may not have a good block. And also they are at high risk for bleeding. And there's one more thing with red hair. And they have a lot more anxiety.
Right.
I'm not aware of any. Sorry.
Right, no, thanks. No, no, Dr. Senthil, again, my personal question to you, again on personalized. This is where actually it happens to be a topic of my personal interest, where I've been doing a lot of work, of course there are 3-4 publications in that. When you talked about CYP2D6, the 4 allele we have published in Journal of Personalized Medicine from US, that's on 4 allele. The other one was CYP2D6 5 allele, that's in American Journal of Therapeutics, that's 2013 in June. My personal question to you is, but of course my topics are mainly related to chronic pain, of course you talked about post-hoc this thing. Is that, are you actually estimating these levels, or you are actually, because when you do the messenger RNA expressions, we do messenger RNA expressions with real-time PCR analysis when it is normalized to GAPDH, which is a housekeeping gene, you know it very well, So, in that context, you would like to enlighten us. Yeah. And of course, sorry, just to complete this thing, we also have worked on BDNF, that's a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, then the NGF, and then the TNF. These are all these genes. So could you please enlighten me?
So regarding the expression, for acute pain, so patients come up for surgery, within a day, the expressions are not that different. So we go by genotype, and so that's an indicator of the protein level and the function of transporter or a receptor. So we don't do expression for acute pain settings, so typical of surgical patients. We all have 20,000 genes. I just talked about a few of them. We look at everything. So only few are related to anesthesia, regional anesthesia, and local anesthetics. So I just focused on opioids and local anesthetics. We do everything, all 20,000. We look at 5 million genetic variation in a typical patient. So that's why we just scratched the surface. It will take at least 10, 20 years to
Oh yeah, absolutely. You are absolutely right. This is something which requires robust designing, something which requires very highly sophisticated statistical analysis. And on top of that, just by doing 20 or 40 patients, we don't know, because it has to be large population-based studies, which will take at least 5 to 10 years. I'm sure you agree with me.
We have recruited so far 2,000 patients. We have looked at 5 million SNPs per patient. Yeah. But even that is not adequate.
Yeah, so, that's right. And how do you think, that single nucleotide polymorphism of one gene will create this pain variation, or you also have to have a single nucleotide polymorphism of another gene in the same, in the same set going together?
Yeah, I think there is a big gene-gene interaction. Say, for example, say Ethiopians have 30% incidence of CYP2D6 ultra-rapid metabolism. If you give codeine to everybody in Ethiopia, not 30% of patients will have respiratory depression and die, because there are some protective mechanisms, say the ABCB1 transporter may be GG on that patient, that may be protecting against. So that's why we had to look at a patient as a whole with the multiple genes and multiple genetic variation. We had to look at gene-gene interactions. That's why we need a lot more patients.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks very much. Of course, if we have any more questions, but before that, of course, I won't, I would just like to add one more to Dr. Anjali. Dr. Anjali, please. When you were quoting the figures of American Society of Regional Anesthesia, that figure of 1 in 40,800 or something with spinal compared to 1 in 6,600 for single shot and 1 in 3,100 for epidural catheter. How do you think they are so different from ESRA reported incidences which are almost to the tube, which is of course a retrospective study of Swedish one, which reported 1 in 1,56,000 spinal and 1 in 18,000 for epidural. Why you see there is so much of variation in the American and European continent?
Sir, because in America in the 90s they were using BD doses.
No,
of
that's acceptable.
Lomon. That's
But-
because of the anticoagulants.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to highlight.
Yeah, that's
that
right.
Indiscriminate use of anticoagulants caused such a high incidence of spinal hematomas.
Acceptable, something
Till-
more beyond that, because both are in the same period over there. Little bit variation in the usage obviously is there, but even then there's a lot of disparity. But yes, definitely one is a retrospective study, the other one is more of a prospective one.
I was under the impression they're both retrospective.
No, the
You might
Swedish
be
one,
right.
the Swedish one is a retrospective one,
Yes,
the
it is a
ESRA which is brought out.
retrospective one.
But
And
the American,
Schroeder one is also, in a way, yes.
the
maybe you're
ESRA,
right.
the ASRA, that's the prospective one.
All right, if you say so, sir.
Any more questions, or that brings us to the end of this topic, and of course, sincere thanks again and deep gratitude to the organizers for having invited us to chair the session, and my sincere thanks to the audience, ladies and gentlemen sitting here, and of course to my dear colleague, Dr. Anup Gogia, please. Thank you very much.
Way you want to do it, whether you want to put a single shot or a catheter, in plane, out of plane. I think a lot of these will be shown in the workshops, what we mean by in plane and out of plane blocks. Now, most of the time, any ultrasound guided block has got a surrogate marker. What we call a surrogate marker is usually a vessel which sticks next to the nerve. So you're looking for a surrogate marker before you look for the nerve. And that's what pretty much I still do in terms of trying to find out where the femoral nerve is. Now, that's again, anatomically, you're trying to achieve a block somewhere there. Now, just see this anatomical section. It nicely shows the femoral nerve is not a single circular nerve. It's actually a bunch of smaller nerves at that level. It's not in a, it's in a sheath. It's in a femoral, it's next to a femoral sheath next to the fascia iliaca. But it is not a single nerve like you'll see in a suprascapular or an interscalene. These are a bunch of nerves together, which have got their own coverings, and you may find that they actually spread out much higher up. They do not come together till the femoral triangle. So you're trying to target these. Now, how do I go about doing them? Usually, an in-plane technique if I'm doing a single shot, and out of plane if I'm doing a catheter technique. Now, quite often it's this in plane. Now, first thing to do is actually scan and try and see if I can get hold of the nerve. Invariably, when you scan initially, what I would get is this: multiple vessels, multiple artery, multiple veins, and probably nothing on the side. And the reason is every person anatomically differs. And femoral artery has got one of the maximum number of variations you can find. So what you do is look for the artery, look for the vein, and then try and trace it upwards. What I normally do is slide the probe a bit carefully to try and see if I can get the artery as a single vessel. Now, as soon as the artery becomes a single vessel, you'll start seeing nicer structures nearby. Now, that is the key to it. You should get a single femoral artery rather than having 2 or 3 arteries there. So, let's see, start seeing a triangular shaped area there. You'll start seeing structures around there. And this is your target. And I still tend to do a Doppler even if I do not, if I find a nice little femoral nerve. There have been numerous occasions when I've seen an artery go right through the femoral nerve or right on top of it. So you should be aware of what you're looking at. So try and do a Doppler as soon as you see where you want to target, your target area. Now, this particular one, the artery is there. I can't see any arteries nearby. If you want, go laterally, look at the fascia iliaca, and then spread it out as much as you want to see. Some people will come and target this area for a fascia iliaca block. I think our next speaker is going to show that. Change your depth. Now, if you've noticed, suddenly the depth has become much smaller. Now, initial scanning you would do with about 3 to 4 centimeter depth. The next one you target, you get your scanning right and get your depth right. Because what you want to do is keep this particular area in focus. Now you've got it in focus, you've got your depth right, then you can start your needling. Needling is the last thing to start. Get your anatomy right before you start needling. Now,
unfortunately, the day you want to record everything, I get a very bad needle. My technician opened up this particular needle. It's not an ultrasound needle. It does not show very well on an ultrasound, but if he's opened it, I have to use it. There's no other alternative there. So this is an in-plane technique. You basically keep the probe, and your needle is going just on the lateral corner of the probe. The probe is usually a linear probe, a high-frequency probe. Again, we'll show it during the workshops. And you're trying to go underneath the probe. Remember, the probe is just, the thickness of the ultrasound waves are just about 1 credit card size. So you're just trying to go in that line and trying to go under the probe. There are ways of doing this. If you can see the needle very well, well and good. If you can't see the needle under the probe, you can start doing something called as a hydrodissection. So usually I would advance, if I have not seen the needle properly, I'll probably put a couple of mils, a mil or so of either saline or local anesthetic. I don't mind using saline. People will say 5% dextrose because they use a nerve stimulator. I use saline. So put a mil or two, try and see if I can find the nerve underneath, or try and find the needle underneath, and see where I'm located compared to the nerve. Now, you will, this is going to be a little bit longer. So you're trying to look at where your needle tip is, and all your local should come right under the ultrasound probe. It should not be anywhere else. If you don't see your local coming out, that means you could be anywhere, whether it's a muscle, artery, vein, anything else. Now, if you see, unfortunately this one, you can hardly see the needle, but you will see it start coming up from somewhere in that corner. Because you will, if you can just make out there's a faint shadow of a needle coming in. This is not an ultrasound needle, and that was a problem. I'll show you something else later. Do a bit of hydrodissection, find out where you are. Now, hopefully, a bit of local anesthetic coming up right at the bottom somewhere. There we are. And what I try and target is under the nerve. I usually don't give it above the nerve. I come to the lateral corner and I try and target it under the nerve. And this is pretty much the same area where I would even put an out-of-plane catheter. So as soon as you start injecting local, you will see that your nerve actually comes up much brighter because you have a hypoechoic structure around it, so you will see the nerve come up much brighter. Now, on a good day, you will find that you can see the nerve much better, you can see the needle much better, but unfortunately, as I said, this was a day when we decided to photograph, and we got a bad needle, and we got a... this is just a recording of some other patient. Now, again, I'm trying to find where the nerve is, and this time around, you'll actually see a nice little nerve come up. That's your nerve, your target area. And this particular recording, you'll even see a needle come up much better because this is a slightly more echogenic needle. Some of the needles are echogenic. I think there's been a talk about it as well. So you'll see a nice little needle come up, and once you get your needle in the right position and you start giving your local, you should see your nerve looking much brighter. This is very common. Quite often people will show you this picture, but you cannot see the nerve before this because you're surrounding the nerve with a hypoechoic fluid. So you actually see the nerve much better. That's ultrasound. That's the only way ultrasound works. So that would be a single shot femoral. Normally my catheters are out of plane, and again try and target the same kind of structure, but I usually end up targeting that corner to try and get the catheter either just next to it or underneath it. If I can get it underneath, I'm quite happy. But sometimes you may have to go through the nerve to get it underneath. Usually, people say don't do that, but if you're doing it blind, you don't know how many times you've actually done it. Just because you can see it makes us more aware about whether we should be doing those kind of things or not. Out of plane, the only disadvantage is you do not see your needle tip very easily. It has to be only hydrodissection. There's no other way. My needle insertion is just about a couple of millimeters away from the probe. Initially, it's a little bit more vertical, then I tend to try and put it a bit horizontal to try and get into the space. Use a lot of saline or a lot of local to do hydrodissection. Usually saline initially, then probably local. I tend to use a standard TUI epidural kit. The other stimulating kits are expensive, so cost is an issue, even though we say that if they can do a TKR for 3 lakhs, we should be able to spend 5,000 on catheters, but still we can manage very well with this. I tend to manage. Some of the patients, like especially interscalings, I would do a stimulating catheter, but here I don't mind because the catheter is going along with the femoral nerve and it tends to go in pretty comfortably. And you can actually see the catheter under ultrasound, or you can try and see the local coming out once you've put the catheter in. Usually leave about 3 to 5 centimeters of catheter inside, about 3 centimeters along the nerve if I can. And I don't tunnel it. Some people do tunnel it. I don't tunnel it because ours stay for only about 48 hours or maximum 72 hours. Our surgeon doesn't like it beyond that. He wants them up and about. So they stay for about 48 hours. Some people have moved over to doing a single shot now. They don't put a catheter at all. So that's the slight difference which is there. I'll just tend to fix it with a tegaderm on top of it, and that is usually sufficient for most of our purposes there. Now, the next one, which I was asked to show, was obturator. Unfortunately, I do not do obturators very well. I think Amjad did one this morning, which came out quite well. So most people would have seen that, and this is not going to be anywhere near that. For obturator, tend to slide the probe a little bit more medial to where the original femoral block's given. Try and locate the anatomy there. Sorry, there was a slide with anatomy. I think we've missed it. There we go. There's been a huge problem with the videos, so that's... Okay, sorry. I think we're just going to skip that. In terms of positioning for obturator, obturator comes out as 2 nerves, the superficial and the deep one. Now, this is an facial block. It is not a nerve block, it's a facial block. So you're basically trying to give drugs between 2 fascia. One is between longus and brevis, and one is between the brevis and the magnus. So you're basically trying to deposit drug in 2 facial planes. You're not trying to do anything more than that. So it does need a little bit more than what you would do for smaller nerves. So probably about 5 to 7 ml is what I would give. But as I said, I don't do it very often, so this is going to be a little bit more tricky. And I hope it comes out. Oh, wow. There we go. Sorry. So that is probably the first one where I would like the drug to go, and this would be the second place where I would like it to go. Now, the first one, I think I gave it off, and it's not there on the recording completely. The second one is a little bit better. The only main reasons for using obturator, people say that medial aspect of the knee, and to some extent the knee is served by the obturator, so for total knee replacements you need to do it. Now, quite often if I add morphine to the spinal, I don't find the need for doing an obturator because it's a sheath block, it's a facial plane block, so remember it is not going to work for more than 3-4 hours. So it's going to be working as much as a spinal morphine would work. So I don't tend to do it very often and just manage with a femoral, most often a single shot femoral with an additive of nowadays dexamethasone after I've been convinced by some of my colleagues. Give about 6 to 8 milligrams of dexamethasone with ropivacaine. Now, if you're looking at a sheath facial plane block, this is where you would normally get your drug spread for the deeper branch of the obturator. Now, the superficial one would be further up, and the deeper one would be somewhere down there. And it's usually a single shot, no chances of putting a catheter down there, so I don't even bother about thinking about that. I think I would have stayed within time, and I think that's about it. Sorry about the quality of the video in some places.
Hello. Any questions for this presentation? Welcome from the house.
One question, why you see you are putting in a catheter outer plane, and the chances of dislodgement are, I think, much more if you are using an in-plane method of catheter insertion. Dislodgement. Outer plane technique. Although it's an easier to pass a third catheter. You have shown through an epidural cannula. Yeah. But the only thing is if you use an in-plane and then the catheter will stay in for a longer time. And if you are not doing tunneling, then there will be more problem.
What I have done in plane
Yeah.
with TUI needle, what I've noticed is sometimes when you're doing it in plane, the catheter comfortably goes across the femoral artery. It actually just goes on to the other side. And
but you can always see under ultrasound imaging.
yeah, but you can't, with the two epidural catheters, you can't always see it under
With
the
epidural.
ultrasound. What you have to look for is hydrodissection. You have to see for the local coming out. And if it goes across, I just spend the next 5-10 minutes searching for where the local is. And I never tend to find it because probably I was initially doing it in plane, as you should for most ultrasound blocks. But that was the problem I had encountered, so I just changed.
Yeah, you're right. Recommendation is that one must use an in-plane method if you're using a catheter.
For
This was
starting,
the
you
younger
should use an
generation.
in-plane. Yes.
This is a younger generation that you must use, if you're using, putting a catheter, and you use an in-plane method, and then the chances of displacement are much, much less. And you can always gaze the needle if you're using stimuplex needles. That's the advice given. But anyway, techniques vary with each person. Any question, please?
Measures do you suggest for preventing or managing the wetting of the dressing once the continuous catheters are put, especially for the femoral? We have faced a lot of problems, and this actually leads to increased risk of infections as well.
The best thing to do for that is actually tunnel the catheter.
That is what now you are not tunneling the catheter.
No,
so
I'm
we don't tunnel the catheters, and this problem we face. So that is why I'm asking.
No, I agree, because I know people will say put a bit of Dermabond and all in it. Dermabond itself is 1,500, 2,000 rupees.
No, we don't use Dermabond.
We can't do that.
So are there any other practical measures to
What
circumvent this?
If I'm very comfortable with my location of the catheter, and if it's gone in the first shot with the TUI, usually it doesn't leak back. And I tend to keep a little bit more of catheter inside. I keep about 5 centimeters. Sometimes on day one, if I find that there is a bit of an ooze or a leak around the catheter, I just tend to take out the dressing, put a gauze, put a tegaderm, and put an elastoplast. Because the chance of infection is if you keep removing it and it keeps peeling off. The only way to do it is not take it off at all. I would actually not take off the dressing. If you've done it in a sterile condition, if you're not peeling the dressing open,